Alright YouTube, hope you're having a great day today. Today I want to take a look at one of the early 60s science fiction works. It actually won a Hugo Award for Best Novel that year. It's written by Brian Aldiss, who is a writer who's not really typically in the sort of hard science fiction genre. A lot of his stuff is more on the science fiction. He was hugely prolific and wrote a ton of stuff. And I want to take a look at Hothouse, which is a novel that he wrote, which was hugely influential on a lot of things that came later in the 70s, post-apocalyptic work, and so forth. So we're going to take a look at it, and this award-winning book. What makes it so interesting, and also what are some of its weaknesses that even the people who publish it admitted, and why it's very influential. So we'll take a look at that here in a little bit. But first, let's take a look at, and like I often will do, is take a look a little bit at the author, Brian Aldiss. Who is he? Particularly when it's my first review of an author. If I come back and do another Aldiss story later on, then I'll go ahead and link back to this one so you can kind of get a chance to feel for who he was. Brian Aldiss was one of the most prolific writers of his day. He would publish tons of short stories and novels a year. He was the Stephen King of science fiction and fantasy for that time period for decades and decades. He's been knighted he's a British writer. He was one of the people that was kind of growing up. He started writing in the mid-50s, and throughout the 60s was a lot of his more prolific area of work. And he was definitely a part of the British new wave of science fiction that was happening. There were a couple of magazines in Britain at the time. One of the leads is New World, which was being edited by Michael Moorcock, who's famous as one of the great writers of science fiction, particularly fantasy. Although he created cyberpunk genre for science fiction too, and I consider him one of the most influential people of all time. In fact, I just published one of my first reviews of a Moorcock story, The Warhound and the World's Pain. We'll be doing a lot more Moorcock stuff coming soon. But he edited, and was famous as the editor. I was one of the people who pushed for sort of this new wave of science fiction. And the science fiction stories of the late 50s through the 60s and the early 70s are very different than the science fiction stories that are being published before then. They are less tethered in the sort of hard science fiction. Here's all the rules, here's how everything's working and such. And instead are more about the imaginative side of things. They're more soft, more imaginative and such. And Hothouse is a perfect example. So Hothouse is a perfect example of this sort of new wave of science fiction that Brian Aldiss is doing. And in particularly, this will be a great example of it because it came in the early 60s, at the early part of that era. But the stories that are written at this time are more controversial because they're not your traditional hard science fiction. And this book in particular does not follow any rules of physics or anything like that. So again, we're going to take a look at Hothouse by Brian Aldiss as the perfect example of this. So what makes Hothouse so interesting and so unique? It's a heavily imaginative post-apocalyptic world. Alright, so what makes Hothouse so imaginative? Great question. And what makes it so different? What sort of hits other people and pushes back? Let's take a look and see. So Hothouse itself is kind of set in a future, in a world, in a post-apocalyptic world where man is basically the last creature that's left, and vegetables of various sorts and plants of various sorts have sort of grown to take on a lot of the sort of niches, ecologically speaking, that animals would have had taking place earlier. So much like, for example, New Zealand in our world had birds that sort of grew up having a lot of the roles that normal creatures would have had, like rodents and mammals and such. Similar to that, you would also, you would have flightless birds and such. You would also have here in his world, plants have taken on the roles of most of the creatures that have previously lived, the various animals and such. Man is one of the few ones left, and he's fighting a losing battle and a losing struggle, really, against the planet, how nasty the planet is. But it's in this post-apocalyptic world. Now, it's the physics in it, even the person who published it said that this world is just I mean, the physics doesn't make any sense. It's not a traditional, a sort of a story that you would expect in science fiction at all. But it was so imaginative that we went ahead, and it's so just evocative that we went ahead and published it anyway. So, what makes it so imaginative? Well, the world it's set in. There are some tribes and stuff. The people you're going to be following, some people like Gran around as he sort of explores, and so you're going to get a chance to tour this sort of ancient sort of concept of this world. But in addition to that, there are these hugely interesting things that Brian Aldiss does. For example, one of the things that he's going to do is he's going to have these giant vegetable spiders that are huge, and they're going to have weaved webs above the rest of the world. And a lot of creatures are going to use these giant vegetable webs made by these giant spiders, and they're going to have created bridges between themselves and the moon, and thus lock the moon into this web of spiders. So that's just, and you can go back and forth between the moon and the sun now by following the giant spider web, just like the spiders do. That's just imaginative, right? It's interesting. Now, I would say he's probably, when I went back and read him, I'd say his stuff is more like fantasy than science fiction. Because it falls more into that sort of, fantasy doesn't have to have its stuff rooted in sort of this hard science fiction. This is where the rules are coming from. This is how it's working, and such. Whereas, your typical science fiction story set in the future would read differently. This is another of the sort of classic science fiction works that are set in a post-apocalyptic world after sort of a nuclear fallout, or some stuff happens that's just not particularly realistic. Not everybody dying and such. Other examples of this would be Hero's Journey, set in the future, where stuff like that starts to happen, or Jack Vance's Dying Earth series, set extremely far into the future where magic has become a thing again. Or similarly, going back to the 20s and 30s, you would have Clark Ashton Smith's Zothique cycle that's also set in the far future, as Earth is beginning to die. So you have this sort of far future Earth, where things are happening post-apocalyptic, or in the far future where things are happening not hard science fiction, or people dying from radiation poisoning, but instead the world has been mutated. And this was probably one of the most influential stories on that sort of that sort of a fantasy feel that you get to your post-apocalyptic works. Lots of things that would have followed from the 70s. I absolutely think that there's going to be some influences in this on role-playing games, for example. It's one of the influences for the creation of the role-playing game Gamma World. That's kind of this post-apocalyptic world where very little that actually happens is happening in sort of this traditional sort of a hard science fiction feel. I'm sure it's also hugely influential on Dungeons & Dragons and some other stuff too. It's a big book in terms of how influential it is. And again, it won an award, and it's just this incredibly imaginative place that it's set on as you kind of tour the world that he has created. But again, it's not a hard science fiction. And again, it was one of the earlier sort of high, sort of new science fiction. So this is also a good example for you to kind of see the new wave of science fiction that was particularly popular for about 15-20 years there, especially in British science fiction, where they were sort of the leaders of this. And Brian Aldiss, as an English writer, is definitely somebody who's going to be pushing the envelope. Have you read this? Have you read Hothouse? What did you think of it? Again, it's kind of exotic out there, but it is incredibly imaginative. So I think it's important to go into it with eyes wide open. You're not going to go into it and say this is one of the best hard science fiction novels I've ever read, even though it's won a novel, the Hugo Award for Best Novel published that year. But it is incredibly imaginative, and it'll stick with you. But it's more on the soft science fiction side by far, and it's not even. I wouldn't even say it's like a Robert Heinlein where the basic assumption actually makes some level of sense, but then it's just moving on to the social world. In this case, it's not even a sort of a Robert Heinlein or an H.G. Wells who were masters of soft science fiction, but rather instead it does feel to me more a fantasy story when I'm reading a feature fantasy than it does a science fiction. And I think by potentially qualifying it as a future fantasy rather than a future science fiction, I think it probably feels a bit better. It's more genreified, I think, in fantasy than science fiction. Although Brian Aldiss is not a science fiction. I mean, he's not a fantasy writer. So I think that's important too. Anyway, so what did you think? Have you read it? Let me know. If you've never read Hothouse before, you've never even heard of Hothouse before, this is Hothouse. I'll put a link down in the comments below. If you like this video, hey, I'd really appreciate it if you'd subscribe. We're going to have so many more videos, reviews. We're going to be taking a look at various analyses and such, and taking a look at different topics within the three major topics of horror, science fiction, and fantasy. And hey, if you've watched me all the way through this video, I really do appreciate it. That you took some time out of your day. So thank you so much for that. This video has probably has a couple of jump cuts in it because I was on duty when I filmed this, and I got a couple of duty calls. So I had to leave and then come back and start over again, which is not something I normally do for this. So unfortunately, this video may have some weird jump cuts for it. So I apologize if that's the case. Once again, thanks for watching. I appreciate it. Bye-bye.